I never thought my life would end that day, but then again, I never imagined how it would end. I had spent my years devoted to the church, to God's work, to prayer, and to the sacraments. But I never expected death to come so suddenly, so violently, so without warning. The day began like any other. I woke before dawn, as I always did, kneeling beside my bed for morning prayer. My heart had been heavy for some time, weighed down by the state of the world, by the unrest, the division, and even the tensions that seemed to be growing within the church. I had spent countless hours praying for Pope Francis, asking for wisdom to guide him, strength to lead the faithful, and clarity in these uncertain times. Yet something inside me was restless, as if I knew, though I could not explain, that something was coming. That morning, I went about my usual routine, preparing for Mass, reviewing the readings, and entering the sanctuary where I had spent so many years. The moment my feet touched the marble floor, a sense of unease washed over me. It was nothing dramatic, just a whisper of unease, a slight dizziness, a feeling that my heart wasn't beating right. I ignored it. I had always been in good health, and besides, there was work to be done. The Mass was as beautiful as ever. The congregation gathered, the prayers rose to heaven, the Eucharist was received, and for a brief moment, everything seemed calm, sacred, untouched by the chaos of the world outside. But as the service ended, and I stepped away from the altar, I felt a sharp pain in my chest again, as if a fist were squeezing my heart. I stopped, gripping the edge of the pew to steady myself. The pain didn't go away, only grew, spreading across my chest and down my left arm. My breathing became shallow, and the surroundings seemed to tilt, blurring at the edges. My vision blurred, my legs wobbled, and suddenly the strength I had always relied on was gone. I remember the moment my knees hit the floor. Someone called my name, but it sounded distant, muffled, as if I were already slipping away. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was the crucifix hanging above the altar, the figure of Christ looking down at me with eyes full of sadness and love. Then everything disappeared. But I did not cease to exist. I became aware of myself again, though I knew I was no longer in my body. At first it was a strange sensation, a lightness, as if I had been removed from the constraints of flesh and bone. I could see, but not with my eyes. I could hear, but not with my ears. It was something beyond the senses of the physical world, something deeper, more true. I looked down and saw my own body lying motionless on the church floor. People gathered around me, some shouting my name, others on their knees, praying fervently. In moments, the scene changed. Paramedics arrived, their movements urgent, their voices quick and focused. One pressed his fingers to my neck and then shook his head. Another brought out a defibrillator, preparing to restart my heart. I should have felt panic, I should have felt fear as I watched my own lifeless body being wrestled with, but I did not. I felt peace, not the kind of peace I had known in moments of prayer or solitude, but something much greater. It was as if all the weight of my earthly concerns, my struggles, had been lifted, leaving only a sense of clarity, of understanding. Then I felt something else, a pull. It started as a gentle tug, but it quickly grew stronger, as if an invisible force was pulling me upward, lifting me up. The church, the paramedics, my body, everything faded away, sounds becoming a whisper as I soared beyond what I knew. The ceiling should have stopped me, but it didn't. I passed through it effortlessly, as if the laws of the physical world no longer applied to me, and then I saw the light. It wasn't like any light I'd ever seen before. It wasn't sunlight, or firelight, or even the warm glow of the candles in the chapel. It was alive, pulsing, breathing, radiating something beyond mere brightness. It carried love, warmth, truth. It wasn't just illuminating, it was calling. As I approached the lightness deepened, and suddenly I was no longer climbing through an earthly space. I was somewhere else entirely, a place beyond time, beyond pain, beyond anything I could comprehend. The air, if it could be called air, was thick with a presence so powerful, so overwhelming, that I fell to my knees the moment I realized what it was. God. I didn't see him directly, but I felt him everywhere. The very essence of his presence was woven into this place. Every fiber of my soul recognized him. I had spent my life praying, seeking him, longing to be in his presence, and now here I was. But even in the peace of that moment, even with the overwhelming love surrounding me, I felt something else, something I hadn't expected. Urgency. I was there for a reason. Something was coming. I opened my mouth to speak, though I didn't know what I wanted to say, but before I could, I was aware of another presence. A figure stepped forward from the light. I had known him before I had even seen his face. It needed no introduction. My soul recognized him instantly. Jesus. He stood before me, clothed in radiance, his presence more powerful than anything I had ever encountered. His light didn't just shine, it carried weight, authority, holiness. It wasn't just a glow, it was alive, moving, enveloping me like a presence I had longed for all my life. His eyes, I had never seen eyes like his. They held everything: love, sorrow, wisdom, power. They weren't just looking at me, they were seeing me, not just my appearance, not just my soul, but everything I had ever been, everything I had ever thought or felt or done. I fell to my knees, overcome. He looked at me not with judgment, not with disappointment, but with a love so deep, so profound, that I wept. Then he spoke. His voice was not like a human voice. It wasn't just sound, it was truth itself. It washed through me, inside me, shaking me to my core. It was gentle yet powerful, tender yet commanding. It's not your time yet. His words carried weight. They weren't just a statement, they were a reality, a truth that couldn't be changed. I blinked, struggling to understand. It's not my time, but I died. I left my body. I felt it. I saw it happen. Before I could ask, he continued, but I need to show you something. And with those words, the light around me changed. A new vision unfolded before my eyes, something I should never have seen, something the world was not prepared for. And suddenly, I knew why I had been brought here. A powerful force pulled me upward, beyond anything I could comprehend. It wasn't like rising through air. It was something deeper, deeper. I was being carried, dragged through what felt like layers of existence, past something invisible but real. The world I knew, the church, my body lying on the cold ground, all faded into the distance, like a forgotten dream slipping away from my grasp. Before me, a great tunnel of light stretched on endlessly, pulsing with an energy I had never experienced before. The light wasn't harsh or blinding. It was alive, enveloping me with warmth, peace, and something else, something urgent. This was no ordinary journey. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense that time as I knew it no longer existed. I wasn't moving through space, I was moving through something much greater. As I moved forward, I became aware of something changing around me. The tunnel was widening, expanding into something vast, infinite, beyond all human comprehension. The peace here was unlike anything on earth. There was no fear, no pain, no doubt. Every burden I had carried, every worry that had ever troubled my heart, was lifted. It was as if I had stepped into the very presence of holiness. Then I realized I was not alone. A figure emerged from the radiance, stepping forward with a presence that immediately brought me to my knees. I didn't need to question who he was. My soul already knew. Jesus. The moment I saw him, my entire being shook. His light wasn't just around him, it was part of him. It flowed like a living presence, carrying power, authority, and an incomprehensible love. His face, radiant beyond description, held an expression of profound sadness and boundless compassion. His eyes locked with mine, and in that instant, I felt more known than I had ever felt in my entire life. He saw everything, every thought I had ever had, every prayer I had ever whispered, every struggle, every failure, every moment of doubt. There was no hiding, no pretending, no need to explain. He knew me completely, and yet there was no condemnation in his gaze, only love. A love so deep, so powerful, that I could barely bear it. Tears filled my eyes as I bowed my head, overcome. The weight of his presence was too much. I could barely breathe under the magnitude of who he was. The air around me vibrated with something indescribable. Holiness, truth, eternity itself. I wanted to speak, to tell him how unworthy I felt, how small I was in the face of such divine glory. But before I could, he stepped closer, and in a voice that was not just sound, but truth itself, he spoke. There is something you must see. His words carried weight, not like a command, but like a reality being spoken into existence. The moment he said them, the space around us shifted. I didn't know what was coming, but I felt a deep, aching urgency. Something was about to be revealed, something I could never have imagined. The world unfolded before me like an open book, but I was not standing on solid ground. I was suspended in something greater than space itself, looking down at the earth from a perspective no human could see with physical eyes. It was as if my soul had been granted vision beyond the veil, beyond time, beyond the illusions that cloud human understanding. Before me, a vast expanse stretched out, and in it I saw churches, thousands of them, millions of them, scattered across the world like stars in the night sky. Some stood tall and radiant, glowing with indescribable light, their walls pulsing with heat, their sanctuaries filled with prayers that rose like golden incense toward the heavens. These churches were alive, not just in the physical sense, but in the spiritual. They were places where the presence of God truly dwelt, where hearts were humbled, where the hungry sought and found him, but not all of them shone. I turned my gaze, and what I saw made my soul tremble. Some churches, once filled with the same divine radiance, now flickered dimly, their light barely holding, dimmed under a weight I could not yet name. Others had gone dark completely, their walls, though grand, bare, their altars, though adorned, empty of true worship. I felt it in my very being. These were places where faith had been replaced by something else, something lifeless. A deep sadness washed over me. I had spent my life serving God, tending the flock, leading people in prayer, believing the church to be an unshakable beacon of truth. But now, here in this divine space, I could see what my human eyes had never fully comprehended, that many had already turned away from him, even within his own home. I turned to Jesus, and when I met his eyes, I saw sadness in them, the pain of a shepherd whose sheep had gone astray. Then he spoke, "My church has forgotten me." His words carried a weight beyond sound. They penetrated to the core of my being. They honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. I couldn't breathe. The words were not condemnation, but they carried the deepest pain I had ever felt. It wasn't my pain, it was his pain. The pain of a God who had given everything for his people, only for so many to turn away, distracted, deceived, or indifferent. I turned toward the vision, and suddenly, I saw faces, countless souls inside these churches that were darkening and fading. Some sat in the pews, their eyes empty, their prayers mechanical, their hands going through the motions of worship, but their hearts absent. Others stood behind the pulpits, preaching words that felt right but had no real power, no conviction, no anointing. They spoke of tradition, of duty, of obligation, but not of relationship. Then I saw something else, the world outside these churches. People wandered, lost, searching. Some had been inside, but had left disillusioned. Others had never entered, convinced there was nothing there for them. I saw faith crumbling, not everywhere, not in every soul, but enough to change the world. And in that moment, I understood. This was not just about a few churches losing their way. This was a spiritual crisis, a change happening before our eyes, unnoticed by most, but catastrophic in its effects. I turned to Jesus, my heart breaking. "Why?" I whispered. "How did this happen?" His face was full of sadness and love. "Because they allowed the world to define me, instead of seeking me for themselves. They built temples, but neglected their hearts. They spoke my name, but forgot my voice." I looked again at the flickering churches, at the people inside them. Many were faithful, yes, many still sought him earnestly. But many were asleep, many were distracted, many were comfortable in empty rituals, blind to how far they had strayed. Then Jesus reached out, and I saw something else, something that made my entire being tremble. I saw leaders, priests, bishops, even those in the highest offices of the church. Some were true shepherds, still fighting for the flock, still steadfast in the faith. But others, I saw their faces, but something was missing. Some wore robes of authority, but had no light in their eyes. Some spoke grand words, but their hearts were tangled up in politics, power, and compromise. Some had begun in the truth, but had grown weary, slowly buckling under the weight of a world that no longer wanted God's truth. And in the distance, at the top of it all, I saw a great and powerful figure, shrouded in light and shadow. I could not make out his face, but my soul knew who he was. I sighed. The Pope. Jesus' expression didn't change, but I sensed something in his presence. A great deep sadness, and also hope. I wanted to ask, what does this mean? Is this a warning, a prophecy? But Jesus spoke before I could form the words. Pray for him. His voice was firm. Pray for my church. And suddenly, I understood. The church was at a crossroads. An unseen but real battle was being fought over its future, and the outcome was not yet decided. I felt my soul tremble as I realized why I had been brought here. This was not just a vision. It was a call to action, a call to pray, to wake up, to return to him before it was too late. The flickering churches, the lost souls, the weary leaders. It wasn't too late yet, but it could be soon. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking. What should I do? His eyes met mine, full of love and urgency. There is more to show you. And with those words, the vision changed again. Suddenly, I found myself in a place I recognized immediately. The Vatican. The imposing beauty of St. Peter's Basilica stood before me, intricately detailed, glowing softly in the light of an overcast sky. But something felt different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a silence that carried weight, as if the very walls of this sacred place were holding their breath. I took a step forward, unsure of why I was there, and then I saw him. Pope Francis. He sat alone, his head bowed in deep prayer. His white robes, though immaculate, felt heavy on his frail body, as if he carried the weight of a burden too great for any man to bear. His hands trembled slightly as they rested in his lap, his breathing slow and labored. I could sense something in him, a weariness, a sadness that went beyond physical exhaustion. For a moment, I simply watched him. The world knew him as the leader of the Catholic Church, a figure revered by millions, a shepherd guiding God's people. But here, in that moment, he was just a man, someone carrying the weight of something greater than himself. I turned to Jesus, who stood beside me, bathed in radiant light, his face inscrutable. What is happening to him? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jesus stared at the Pope. The weight of the church is heavy, he said, his voice quiet but filled with unmistakable sadness. I felt my chest tighten. Is he suffering? Jesus turned to me, his eyes full of love and sadness. Many of my pastors are struggling. Some lead with righteousness. Others have been deceived by the world. I swallowed hard. His words carried an urgency I could not ignore. I looked back at Pope Francis. His lips moved in silent prayer, and though I could not hear what he was saying, I could feel it. A deep plea, a cry for guidance, for strength. But as I watched, something changed. The air around us grew thicker, and suddenly the Vatican itself seemed to waver, as if between two realities. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the walls, creeping toward the Pope like invisible hands reaching out. I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was something there, something pressing down on him. I turned to Jesus in alarm, but he remained still, his gaze steady. The battle is not of flesh and blood, he said, but of powers and principalities, of unseen forces working both within and against my church. A profound realization dawned on me then. This was not just about one man, it was about something bigger. I saw visions of conversations behind closed doors, powerful figures whispering, decisions being made in secret, influences pushing and pulling the direction of the church. Some hearts were genuine, truly seeking to do God's will. Others were not. I saw division. Some within the church stood firm in the truth, holding firm to the teachings of Christ. Others had begun to give in, not out of direct rebellion, but out of fear, out of pressure, out of deception. I turned to Jesus again, desperate for clarity. What does this mean? What is happening at the highest level of the church? His expression remained steady, but I could feel the weight of his sadness. The church is my bride, he said, but many no longer recognize me within it. Some seek power, some seek comfort, some seek to please the world rather than me. I shivered, feeling the truth of his words cut through me. I looked back at Pope Francis. He was still praying, still seeking God in the midst of whatever forces were pressing against him. But I knew, deep in my being, that a great change was coming, one that would affect not just him, but the entire church and the entire world. I felt Jesus' presence beside me, like an anchor holding me steady in the face of all that I was seeing. What should we do? I asked, my voice shaking. How can we help? Jesus' eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. Pray. Pray for my church. Pray for its leaders. Pray for those who are lost in deception, that they may see the truth before it is too late. I nodded, my soul filling with urgency and responsibility. I had always prayed for the church, but now I realized it was more important than ever, because something was coming, and it was not yet decided what path the church would take. The view shifted again, and suddenly I was no longer in the Vatican. Instead, I was in a large hall, a place of importance, though I could not name it. Surrounding me were bishops, cardinals, priests, men who had dedicated their lives to serving God. Their robes signified their status within the church, but their faces revealed something deeper. Some were worried, their brows furrowed as they debated among themselves. Others were angry, gesturing wildly, their voices raised in frustration. And then there were those who were silent, their faces expressionless, but their eyes filled with something that made my stomach churn. Doubt. There was division there. At first, I could not understand what they were arguing about, but as I listened, the words became clearer. The church must adapt to the times, a voice insisted. We must modernize, or we will lose the next generation. Another voice responded, firm but calm. We do not change the truth to fit the world. The world must return to the truth. A third voice, filled with frustration, added, people are leaving the church. We are losing our influence. We must do whatever it takes to stay relevant. I turned to Jesus, feeling the weight of what I was hearing. What is happening? His expression remained steady, but his voice carried a deep sadness. The enemy seeks to divide and weaken my people, he said. He sows doubt among my pastors, pitting them against each other, distracting them from my voice. I looked again at the men before me. I saw some who genuinely wanted to do the right thing, who truly believed they were protecting the church. But I also saw confusion, fear, and, worst of all, compromise. I saw doctrines being debated not with prayer and discernment, but with political strategy. Decisions were being made based on popularity, not truth. I saw leaders struggling, not because they lacked faith, but because the weight of external pressure was crushing them. They feared rejection by the world, feared losing the support of the people, and in that fear, some had begun to give in. Some had abandoned certain teachings, softening their stance to please the masses. Others had remained silent when they should have spoken the truth, and some had gone even further. I saw false teachings spreading like smoke, thick and deceptive, seeping into churches, leading even the faithful astray. It sounded holy, it sounded loving, but underneath it was a distortion of the gospel. God wants everyone to be happy, they said. All roads lead to the same truth. Sin is just a matter of perspective. I felt my heart race. But Lord, I said, that's not what you taught. Jesus turned to me, his voice calm, but filled with undeniable authority. My sheep know my voice. The words struck something deep within me. Not everyone would be deceived. I saw some priests and bishops standing firm, refusing to give in, refusing to let the truth be distorted. Some were ridiculed for it, attacked, even by other clergy. Some were removed from their positions. I saw entire congregations split, some following the truth, others following what was easier to accept. And then I saw something even more painful: people leaving the church altogether. I watched as some walked out of their churches for the last time, shaking their heads in disillusionment. They had seen corruption, contradictions, and confusion, and instead of seeking Jesus himself, they chose to leave it all. My heart ached to see this. Good people, faithful people, lost because they had looked to men instead of God. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking. How can we stop this? How can we bring them back? His eyes, full of sadness and love, met mine. Prayer. Prayer is the weapon against deception. Prayer is the bridge that leads the lost back to me. My people must return to me, not just to religion, not just to tradition, but to me. I nodded, the weight of his words pressing deep into my soul. I understood now. The church was not failing because God had abandoned it. It was struggling because many within it had stopped seeking him first. The enemy's goal was not to destroy the church from the outside. It was to divide it from within, to get people so caught up in politics, in popularity, in pleasing the world, that they forgot why the church existed in the first place: to bring souls to Jesus Christ. I knew then what needed to be done. We needed to return to prayer. We needed to return to the truth. We needed to stop putting our faith in men and put it back in God. And most of all, we could not be deceived. I stood in silence as the sight before me changed once more. Suddenly, I was no longer inside the great hall where the church leaders debated, nor was I within the walls of any cathedral. Instead, I found myself in the middle of a vast battlefield, unlike anything I had ever imagined. The air was thick with tension. A dark mist covered the sky, swirling with an unnatural heaviness, pressing down like an invisible force. The battlefield stretched on endlessly, but it was not filled with armored soldiers. Nor was this a war fought with earthly weapons. This was something far greater. I saw angels and demons locked in combat, their presence more real than anything I had ever known. This was not a battle of steel and swords. It was a battle of power, of will, of truth versus deceit. The angels were in radiant armor, their very existence exuding authority and purity. They glowed with the light of heaven, their presence cutting through the darkness like piercing flames. Some held swords of fire, others carried shields that glowed with divine brilliance. And then I saw their enemies. The forces of darkness were twisted, their forms shifting like smoke, grotesque yet vaguely human at times. They whispered as they moved, their words slipping through the air like poison. I couldn't understand their language, but I could sense the intent behind it: fear, doubt, confusion. They weren't just striking hard, they were corrupting, spreading deception, poisoning minds, influencing the world in ways most couldn't see. Then I realized something chilling. They were attacking the church. I turned and saw. The church itself stood at the center of the battlefield, not as a building, but as a spiritual entity stretching across the earth, and it was under siege. Darkness surrounded it, pressing in on it from every side. I saw entire churches being swallowed up, not by physical destruction, but by spiritual decay. Compromise, false teachings, fear, and division were consuming them like a slow poison. I wanted to scream, to run forward, to stop what was happening, but then I saw something else. Something that made my breath catch. There was light. At first it seemed small, flickering, struggling against the shadows. But as I looked closer, I realized what it was. It was prayer. In the middle of the battlefield, small groups of people knelt, their hands clasped, their voices raised, not in fear, but in faith. Their words rose like fire, illuminating the darkness around them. And as their prayers reached the heavens, something incredible happened. The angels grew stronger. When someone cried out to God in genuine faith, light burst forth from their words. It wasn't about ritual or repetition. These were real prayers, spoken from desperate hearts, from believers who truly sought Jesus. And with each prayer, the darkness receded. The demons screamed as the light burned through them, the lies they whispered crumbling before the power of the truth. I watched as some churches that had seemed weak, barely holding together, began to ignite with divine fire, their light spreading, their faith rekindled. It was then that I understood. The church was not doomed. The enemy could not destroy it completely, but he was trying to weaken it from within, to corrupt it, to make believers forget the power they had. I turned to Jesus, my voice shaking. What must we do? His eyes, full of sadness and hope, met mine. The church will stand, he said, but only if my people pray. His words echoed in my soul. This battle was not just for priests, not just for bishops, not just for the Pope. It was for every believer. This war was being fought in the unseen, but its impact was felt in every church, in every home, in every soul on earth. I looked again at the battlefield. The darkness was still there, still fighting, still trying to consume everything. But now I could see hope. As long as there were believers who prayed, as long as there were people who truly sought Jesus. Not just in words, but in their hearts. The darkness would never win. But we needed to wake up. We needed to stop being passive. We needed to fight, not with anger, not with arguments, but with prayer, truth, and unwavering faith. As I stood there, watching the battle unfold, I realized something. The outcome of this war was not yet decided. The church would stand, but whether it remained strong or weak depended on us. The vision before me shifted once more, and I found myself on the edge of something vast, something beyond time, beyond space. Jesus stood beside me, his presence unwavering, his gaze filled with sadness and hope. I didn't know where I was, but I could feel the weight of what was about to be revealed. The air around us was thick with something unseen, something pressing. A decision was being placed before me, before all of us. Then Jesus lifted his hand, and in an instant, I saw two paths stretching out before me. On the first path, I saw the renewed church. It wasn't perfect, no human institution ever would be, but it was alive. I saw churches filled not by obligation, but by a genuine hunger for truth. People prayed with fire in their hearts, their words piercing the darkness. I saw young and old seeking Jesus, not just following tradition, but truly finding him. The light within these churches was bright, a warmth that radiated outward, reaching the hearts of those who had once been lost. Leaders were humbled. The focus was no longer on status or power, but on Jesus alone. The distractions, the divisions, the political games that had infiltrated the faith were cast aside. I saw revival, not just in one place, but all over the world. Nations that had once grown cold returned to God. I saw communities transformed, families restored, lives changed, not by force, not by fear, but by love and truth. And then the vision changed. I turned to the second path, and my heart sank. This was the church that had weakened, the church that had allowed deception to take root. I saw empty pews, cathedrals that once housed thousands now gathering dust. I saw churches turned into mere social halls, stripped of their power, their holiness, their purpose. I saw leaders who no longer preached the truth, but what was expedient, what pleased the world. I saw people who once had faith fall into confusion, abandoning their beliefs, turning to ideologies that made them feel comfortable rather than convinced. That church still existed, but it had no power. It was a church that had compromised too much, a church that had tried so hard to be accepted by the world that it had forgotten its mission. And in its weakness, darkness spread. Without a strong church, people were lost, searching, disoriented. I turned to Jesus, the weight of this choice bearing down on me. "Which way will we go?" I asked, my voice shaking. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me, through me, as if probing the depths of my soul. Then he spoke, his voice full of warning and love. "That is, for my people to decide." His words struck me like a thunderbolt. This was not set in stone. It was a choice. The church was not doomed, but neither was it automatically saved. What I had seen was not prophecy, but possibility. Then Jesus spoke again, his tone filled with a holy urgency. "Put your faith not in men, but in me." My word never changes. The moment he said it, I understood everything. The church should never have been built on the strength of men. It was built on Christ alone. Popes come and go, bishops rise and fall. Leaders can be righteous or corrupt, but the foundation of the church, Jesus himself, never wavers. The problem was not just bad leadership or worldly corruption. It was that people had put their trust in men instead of God. Many had become lukewarm, trusting in tradition instead of truth, following religion without relationship. And that was why the church was at a crossroads. If the people, the body of Christ, did not wake up, if they continued to put their faith in leaders instead of Jesus himself, the church would fall into weakness, and the world would suffer for it. But if people would return to Jesus, if they would pray, if they would seek truth, if they would reject compromise and deception, then the church would be renewed. That was the mission Jesus was setting before me. I needed to wake people up. I needed to warn them. I needed to tell them that their faith could not depend on leaders, on positions, on titles. It needed to be rooted in Jesus and his word alone. I looked at the two paths before me one last time. The renewed church, the weakened church. The choice was clear, but would the people make the right choice? Everything around me changed in an instant. The weight of Jesus' words still pressed down on my soul. But before I could respond, before I could beg to stay, I felt it. A gentle but firm force began to pull me away from the radiant presence of Christ. My heart ached at the thought of leaving, of returning to a world that suddenly seemed so far removed from this reality. I turned to Jesus in despair. "Please," I whispered, "let me stay." His eyes, filled with a love deeper than anything I had ever known, met mine. There was sadness there, but also purpose. "It is not your time yet." The words settled upon me like a decree, unalterable, final. I had no choice, yet my soul yearned to stay, to be in that place of peace, of truth, of overwhelming love. How could I go back? How could I return to a world where people were lost, where deception reigned, where faith was disappearing. My voice shook as I pleaded one last time. I don't know if they'll believe me. I don't know if I can do this. Jesus stepped closer, his presence filling every part of me. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and in that single touch, all doubt, all fear, dissolved. You are not responsible for who you believe, he said. You are only responsible for speaking the truth. I wanted to hold on, to cling to his presence, to refuse the force that was pulling me back, but it was too late. I felt myself being dragged, falling fast and uncontrollably, as if I were being pulled through space itself. The warmth of his presence faded, the glow of the light dimmed, and then, darkness. A suffocating silence surrounded me. And then, sound. A deafening beep filled my ears. A rush of air hit my lungs like fire. My body jerked violently, as if something had shocked me back to life. My chest burned, my limbs heavy, and a sharp pain shot through my body, reminding me that I was human again. I was back. Blurred figures loomed over me, voices shouting in frantic urgency. He's back. We have a pulse. I gasped, coughing, feeling the weight of my body return as I was thrown back into the confines of flesh and bone. The bright white lights above me felt strange, sterile, nothing like the glow I had just left. The cool air against my skin made me shiver. I could hear the whir of medical equipment, the beeping of machines, the hurried footsteps of doctors and nurses moving around me. Reality came crashing back. A doctor leaned over me, his eyes wide with shock. We lost him, he murmured, almost as if he couldn't believe I was speaking, breathing, alive. I tried to respond, but my throat was dry, my body weak. My limbs shook as if they no longer belonged to me. I turned my head slightly, trying to focus my vision, trying to process what had happened. Had all of this been real? Had I really been in the presence of Jesus? Had I really been shown what was to come? Then, like a flood, it all came back. The vision of the church, the deception, the battle raging over the souls of the believers, the urgency in Jesus' voice, the warning, and most of all, his final words. You must go back. You must tell them what you have seen. I tried to sit up, but gentle hands pushed me down. Rest, Father, a nurse said, her voice soft but firm. You need time to recover. But I didn't have time. I needed to speak. I needed to warn them. I forced the words out, my voice barely a whisper. I need to tell them. The doctor frowned. Tell who? I swallowed, my throat dry, but managed to speak despite the weakness. Everyone in that moment, I knew I could never go back to life as it was before. I had seen the truth, and now I had no choice but to share it. When I was finally released from the hospital, everything seemed different. The world around me looked the same sky, the same streets, the same buildings, but I wasn't the same. I couldn't be, I had seen too much. For days, I struggled to put into words what had happened to me. At times, I even questioned myself. Was it real? Had I really stood before Jesus? Had I really witnessed the battle over the church, the deception creeping into the hearts of believers? Or was it all some fever dream, a hallucination caused by my failing heart? But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, I knew the truth. It was real, realer than anything I had ever known. The weight of Jesus' words pressed down on my soul, an urgency I couldn't ignore. I had been sent back for a reason. At first, I didn't know where to begin. How do you tell people something so profound? How do you explain a vision so powerful, so urgent, when the world is already distracted, too caught up in its own chaos to listen? But I remembered Jesus' words. You are not responsible for who you believe. You are only responsible for speaking the truth. And so I began to speak. I told my fellow priests what had happened. Some listened with wide eyes, nodding in awe, their hands shaking with conviction. Others dismissed it, offering gentle smiles but skeptical looks. Near-death experiences can be powerful. One said, but sometimes they are just the mind trying to make sense of the trauma. I could sense the doubt in his words, but I knew better. I reached beyond the walls of the church. I spoke to my congregation, to friends, to anyone who would listen. I told them what I had seen, the deception creeping into the church, the false teachings, the way so many had lost sight of Christ in favor of rituals and traditions, devoid of true faith. I warned them that prayer was more powerful than they understood. I had seen with my own eyes how the prayers of the faithful created light, pushing back the darkness, holding back the forces that sought to destroy. I told them that the church needed to return to Jesus, not just to tradition, not just to ceremony, but to Him. Faith was not about rules, not about status, not about empty words. It was about knowing Christ, following His voice, walking in His truth. I spoke about Pope Francis. I told them what I had seen. The weight on his shoulders, the struggles within the Vatican, the urgency of this moment in history. Whether he was a righteous shepherd or a man influenced by the pressures of the world was not for me to judge. But I knew one thing for sure. He, along with all other leaders of faith, needed our prayers. This was a crucial moment for the church, a crossroads. I saw deception spreading like a shadow over the world, not just outside the church, but within it. Some leaders were leading their flocks righteously, but others had been deceived. The enemy seeks to divide my people. This warning from Jesus echoed in my mind constantly. I could see it unfolding, believers arguing about doctrine, about leadership, about the future of the faith, while the real battle was being fought in the unseen. And so I kept speaking. Some believed me immediately. I saw the fear in their eyes, but also hope. Hope that there was still time to go back, to recover what had been lost. Others mocked me. They said I was just another priest making wild claims. Some even suggested that I had imagined the whole thing. The church has been through worse. They scoffed. We don't need warnings from a priest who nearly died. Things will go on as they always have. I wanted to be angry, but instead I felt sad. They didn't see it. They didn't understand that this time was different. And then I realized, this was exactly what Jesus meant. Some will listen, some won't, but you have to try. And so I kept going. I pray more than ever. I urge others to do the same. I call my fellow believers to remain rooted in the truth, not in the words of men, but in the Word of God. I warn them, do not be deceived. I remind them, this is not about fear, it is about choice. The future of renewal is still possible, but only if we return to God now. And so I leave you with this message. Do not wait until it is too late. The time to return to God is now. Pray. Seek the truth and stand firm in the faith. If this message resonated with you, share it, spread the word, like, subscribe, and stay tuned. The times ahead will test our faith, but those who abide in Christ will not be shaken. May God bless you.